Hello, 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 and a big warm welcome back to Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your co host, Basim Hijazi, or Buzz, and with me, as always, my lovely co host on the right here, Bastian Harth. It's been a while, my friend. How you been doing? It's been a while since we've been here on the show together.
Hi, Buzz. Yeah, it's good to see you again. Yeah, the last month was, I think, particularly busy for the both of us, and that's why we haven't been live for all the viewers and listeners. But we're happy to be back, and we're happy to continue doing this, of course. And we actually have for the coming months, including today, some really cool guests, I would say, Buzz.
I
But
agree.
I'm
No,
looking.
no, definitely. We've been hard at work, and today's no exception. And hopefully, we'll be able to get more content churned out for you in the near future. But we've definitely been working behind the scenes on, crafting something special for you guys. So thank you so much for your support as always. Well, Bastian, what we're going to be talking about in this episode today is, how in the past couple of episodes we've been talking a lot about startups, entrepreneurships. Um, I think we've only briefly touched on the subject of Japan's education system. We've done that a couple of times in relation to startups. And today we're going to be diving deeper into that. So, some of the questions I'm looking to answer is, to what extent does Japan's education depend on technology? Is Japan doing enough to harness technology to facilitate learning in general? That's what I want to get deeper into today. And I'm very pleased to introduce this episode's guest who can help us, dive deeper into that question. He's someone who's specialized in Edtech. He's someone who wants to revolutionize education from the ground up, from his own words, from the last time we spoke to him. And he's the co founder and representative of a social enterprise called Youth Who Code. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you today our special guest, Tsuyoshi Domoto, or Yoshi for short. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Buds, and thank you, Bastian, as well, for very kindly and generously inviting me to be a guest on Bento Bureau. So, hello, everyone. My name is Tsuyoshi Domoto. Feel free to just call me Yoshi. And as Buzz kindly introduced, I'm the representative director and one of the co-founders of Youth Who Code.
Well,
Yoshi, it's fantastic to have you on. Thanks for also making clear where your name comes from. Always lovely to see that little character, and I think everyone will be able to kind of recognize it immediately.
Yes, definitely.
definitely didn't think that we'd be having the Yoshi himself on the show today. So thank you so much for joining
Yeah,
us. You know, I,
of course.
Yoshi, I want to start this off just by asking you. You were telling us a little bit about yourself in our last call. You've spent a lot of
Mm,
time, you would probably identify as someone who's Japanese, you'd identify as a Kikoku Shijo because
mm,
you've spent a lot of time abroad in various places around the world.
mm,
How would you describe yourself in terms of your
mm.
relation to Japan? And do you ever sort of struggle to pinpoint your identity as someone who's a third culture kid?
Yeah, of course. So thank you for that question. I I would say that, so I've struggled with my identity for a large part of my life. And I think it's only been recent where I've come to sort of accept and be also proud of who I am. So outside of Japan, I would always sort of refer to myself or introduce myself as a third culture kid, right? You've heard of the term. And for some of the listeners who haven't, it's a term that describes children who spend their formative years in places that are not their parents' homeland. So in my case, I am Japanese. I was born in Sapporo, Japan, which is a city in the north, but I spent time in Taiwan for preschool and kindergarten. I spent time in Hong Kong for primary school and middle school, and I also spent some time in South Korea for my high school. So I'm very much a product of globalization in today's world. Um, and the term that you used earlier, hikoku shijo, right? That is a Japanese term that's used to describe children like myself. So we're the children of Japanese expatriates who spent a significant time of their developmental years abroad, but then returned to Japan for one reason or another.
Mhm. The term Kikokushijo, at least from what I know, has a bit of a negative nuance to it, or is it
Mm,
just me who's wrong? Is there not
mm.
like some kind of stigma around Kikokushijo?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that, there are definitely positive elements, but also drawbacks to being called a kyokushijo. Um, this term sort of became more and more familiar, I would say, in the 80s, right? When the children the children of the expatriates who returned to Japan and became adults in the 1980s. Some of them became singers, celebrities, so they became well known to the Japanese masses. Um, and I would say that, yeah, like um, it's hard to describe, but there is, of course, these people come from a certain sort of level, or I would say a class, and that's not really approachable or relatable with the general Japanese public. So sometimes, like when you say, "Oh, I'm a Kikuchijo," sometimes I think people sort of misinterpret you as you showing off or thinking that you are like above someone else, when that's not true at all. That just describes your upbringing and the way you were, yeah, naturally brought up.
That's really interesting. And you, I mean, going back to growing up outside of Japan, you didn't just grow up in Taiwan, did you? You grew up in several countries around Asia. If I recall, you also spent time in South Korea, for instance. I mean, what did those experiences sort of teach you about your identity in terms of growing up here and then there and then, especially in the Asian region where I feel like, my time in Japan, I realized identity is something that people take very seriously, like is like it more so than what I would say. Like for instance, I come from a heritage of Palestinians, but
Oh, interesting.
my nationality is actually British, so because I was born in the
Oh, cool.
UK.
I see.
uh, and I grew up there until I was around 12, and then I moved to Doha, Qatar, which is where I'm working right now. And then
Right.
I went to study in Japan. So I have altered around the globe a couple of
Wow.
times myself. And that has
Wow.
definitely, like, I can relate to what you're saying in terms of, like, what do I identify with the most?
Mm,
But I can
mm, mm.
imagine for Asia specifically, because my time in Japan really made me see, identity is something people take very seriously, more so than I've ever seen in the Middle East or in the UK, where things are more of a melting pot.
Right,
So,
right, right. So yeah, no, definitely. I spent a significant amount of time in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. And I attended international schools in each of these countries. But of course, I think even though I was at an international school, because of my Japanese identity, whenever we would study about history, especially when it came to World War II, there would be students or there was one student that made comments like, "Oh, Yoshi, it was your grandparents that waged war on us," and stuff like that, you know. So yeah, I always felt like I I had to also defend Japan at times, um, and it really put me in a pretty uncomfortable position at times because I primarily identify myself as a third culture kid, not a
hmm.
Japanese guy, right? but at the same time, people would see me as a Japanese kid living abroad. So it was at times definitely challenging to kind of sort of find my way between those identities. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I kind of, but yes.
go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of jump in there and ask, you say that you identify yourself now really as a Japanese, but I can imagine, and you touched upon it a bit, that it must have been quite challenging if you've basically not lived in your home country
Oh,
during
definitely.
your childhood or teenage years.
Yeah.
How did it actually get to the point when you said, okay, like, I am Japanese. I feel Japanese. What kind of struggles and challenges have you faced?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Bastian. So, um, you know, I think that if my parents had sent me to a stereotype or local Japanese school, um, if I returned to Japan, if my parents had sent me to like a local Japanese school, then that would have been a pretty terrifying experience for me. But luckily, they sent me to an international school during that 1 year when I was back here in Japan. And that school was full of other TCKs or third culture kids or Kyokushijos like me.
Hmm.
And I really felt at home. I felt very comfortable. I felt like I found my people, you know. We even have our own language where we kind of mix Japanese and English. So we would say stuff like, yeah, yeah, that movie was, really cool. 最初はちょっとどうだったかね、わかんないけど、at the end it was good. You know what I mean? Like we kind of
Yeah.
Wow.
mix English and Japanese, and then it's a really unique language that is only spoken between amongst ourselves, amongst like this TCK like crowd. Um,
Hmm.
and I think when I returned to Japan, when I found that community, I felt very safe. I felt like I belonged, and I felt, oh, I'm Japanese, but at the same time, there are other people like me.
Hmm.
I'm no longer alone. I'm no longer unique. There are other people that have similar upbringings, and they
Hmm.
share my values. So I'm actually very, very grateful that my parents they sent me to an international school where I was able to quote unquote find my people. Because if I had been sent to a typical like or a public school here in Japan, then I might have been bullied. I might have had a
Hmm.
very, very difficult or painful experience here.
Hmm. Can I ask, were your parents interested in basically keeping you connected to your own culture?
That's a really good question. So my father worked for a Japanese tutoring company called Kumon. And all of my Japanese that I learned throughout my whole life was actually through Kumon, was doing these worksheets at home. And and yeah, I think my parents, of course, my parents wanted me to sort of, study the Japanese language and made sure that I was able to speak it. Um, but my parents were very strange in a way that they never envisioned me to have like a life in Japan. Um, yeah, my parents were actually pretty proactive about pushing me to go to school in the US and having
Hmm.
a life outside of Japan.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if they're really happy about me, coming back to Japan and doing what I'm doing right now. But they had always envisioned for me to live a life outside of Japan.
Wow. No,
I see.
and you mentioned about no going back to your experience with schools and Japanese education. I like the double coffee drink. It was
Yeah.
perfectly in sync there, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
No, but going back to what you mentioned about schools, no, it's really great that you had that sense of belonging. That's something that I personally struggled with in the UK at times
Mm,
and a couple of
mm,
times here. So I can definitely, see how important that is to have that sense of belonging. But as someone who
right.
works in education now, what has
Mm,
your experience been with the education system growing up? did you feel like uh, you reaped the most that you could from those education systems, or do you feel like you struggled academically, besides, being feeling like you're part of a community? What has been your experience with education growing up?
Mm. So I think in my case, I was very fortunate because I didn't have to switch education systems. So from preschool, kindergarten, all the way up to high school, my parents sent me to an international school. And usually with international schools, there are international schools around the world, but the fundamentals of an international school is the same in that they teach in the medium of instruction is usually English, and it's based on a fairly Western centric curriculum. And so, although I had to move from Taiwan to Hong Kong, and then Hong Kong to Japan for a year, and then from there to South Korea, it 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 didn't really disrupt my studies because it was always within the larger international school system.
Mhm.
Hmm. It's the
Buzz, I
same
know
here,
where you.
actually. I grew up, I was studying, my school. I went to an international school as well,
Oh,
and they
nice.
follow the IGCSEs, which comes from the UK. And I also
Ah,
took IB. So I'm wondering,
yes, yes. I
was
took diabetes.
you took IB as well? So, but
Hmm.
before that, the schooling that you went through, was it based on an American system of schooling or more towards Europe?
I would say in my case, it was for primary school, middle school, it was Canadian, and
Okay.
for high school, it was American.
Very interesting. No, I just
Although,
wanted to
yeah,
know. Yeah.
yeah,
There's one question I wanted to ask actually before, and so I'm going back a bit. In the
sure,
podcast,
no
we can
problem.
basically bring it and put it together. But I think one of the questions that I still wanted to ask you now, after the whole situation, after the question regarding your parents,
Mm.
is what does it actually mean to you to be Japanese, since you say that you identify as Japanese? Now, there is a textbook version of that, but I think there's more to it, right? It's your own feeling. So I'm asking more the emotional side, the characteristics you think like, oh, these make me Japanese.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, I think that, the sort of, at least my definition of what it means to be Japanese is to have Japanese values.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
so values like honor, values like respect. Um, yeah, I think it's no longer blood, it's no longer appearance, it's no longer heritage. It's based on values. And I think this sort of reimagined definition of what it means to be Japanese is going to become really important for us here in the 21st century because we are not going to survive in a globalized world if we view Japanese people as those who purely have Japanese blood in them.
Hmm.
We're simply just no longer going to survive. And we have to become an open country that's welcoming of immigrants and of people from all backgrounds.
Hmm.
And right now, unfortunately, in order for you to obtain a Japanese passport, either one of your parents have to be Japanese by blood. So it's a
Hmm.
very restrictive sort of form of citizenship. And I
Hmm.
hope that the government will revise that and change that.
Hmm. See, I love that you say that because when you rely on textbooks, which of course is just text and it's based on research, they would really define Japaneseness as having the blood, the origin, having a
Yep,
passport or the nationality, a national ID card, speaking the language, looking Japanese, so appearance is
right,
even possible. So there are kind of lots of criteria which make a Japanese person actually a Japanese. And with
right,
what you said, it changes this up a little
right.
bit, and it would actually steer the discussion. So I really wanted to pinpoint that and bring that out
Mm,
in this episode because I find that quite fascinating and interesting.
yeah, that's
But
important.
going, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But going back to now Buzz topic with education, and that's actually what we're talking about here a little bit today as well, Edtech. I think to just start with it, you've experienced definitely a different education system than most Japanese, since you've been to international schools and you were internationally educated. Maybe to give it a bit more of an easy entrance for you in that regard, is maybe tell us a little bit about Youth Who Code. What is it? Why did you start it?
Okay, sure. So Youth Who Code is a social enterprise with a mission of making tech education fun and accessible to all. And I started this organization with my co-founder, Joshua Wong, because we both believe that tech education has the power to empower individuals and change lives in the world around them. So, currently when it comes to programming education in Japan and many other countries, it's still something that's only accessible to those from, I would say, like well-off households or backgrounds. So there is definitely a problem with access. And in addition to that, there's a huge gap in gender between male and female programmers. Or this is actually the case for the STEAM subjects in general. But this is a statistic from 2010. But the Japan census found that only 14.4% of software developers were women. Um, and unfortunately, I know it's been 10, 11 years since then, but I think that that number has only marginally increased since then. And at Youth Who Code, we believe that, um, programming is a powerful tool that one should use to really empower their own lives and the world around them. So that's why we're trying to sort of target the younger population, because when they're young, they're still more malleable. And so we're trying to get more younger women and also people from diverse backgrounds interested and more proficient in tech so that they can build a world that is in their mind, build a world that they believe is important to them.
That is incredibly fascinating to hear from my side and what I know about Japan, given, how lucrative the video game industry of Japan is, for instance.
Mm,
I always
mm,
had this impression that they've always prioritized that sort of education related to programming, technology, and, preparing these generations for these sorts of industries that are thriving in Japan. But so
mm.
I was very surprised to actually, read the news last year and realize that Japan has only started really incorporating a subject like programming into its national curriculum only recently.
Yeah,
Despite, that thing about, how lucrative of an industry it is in Japan and how much of
right,
an influence they have around the world.
right. Right, definitely. So Japan made programming education compulsory just last year in 2020, starting from April for all elementary school, for public elementary school kids. So we are definitely behind. We are behind countries like yours in the UK. UK made it compulsory, I think, way back. Same with South Korea. So Japan is definitely lagging behind. And I do understand that, outside of Japan, Japan it does a really great job of really marketing itself as this advanced, technologically like superior nation. But both of you have lived in Japan, and I think both of you understand that that's sometimes really not the case, you know?
Mm.
Um, and and also, I think that we also have to make a distinction between hardware and software. With hardware, Japan is, I guess, even to this day, relatively still at the forefront of the industry. But when it comes to software, oh, we are embarrassingly lagging behind.
Mhm.
And that's also an area I hope that Youth Who Code can change.
Mhm. And many say as well that software is actually the future of technology, right? Because
Exactly.
hardware is getting towards its limitations. But Japan, yeah,
Exactly.
is very, very strong when it comes to robotics, I believe, right? They're still
Yes.
very, very strong in that field. And
Yes.
well, car manufacturing, of course, helps with that. I was wondering, so they made it mandatory last year, but are schools actually capable of putting it or implementing this change?
Right. So, unfortunately, it started the same time as COVID, right? The Japanese in Japan, at least the new school year starts on in April, and that was right around the same time when COVID really started to escalate here in Japan. And so I don't think that the government was able to really, or at least the public schools were able to really roll out the whole the program in the way in which they wish they could have. So, for example, a lot of the schools were either closed or it became increasingly challenging for students to be able to physically attend schools. So what happened was that a lot of teachers had to actually distribute classroom material on bicycles. It's a real story that I heard of teachers distributing paper material on bicycles to
Okay.
their kids. And this is 2020. This is 2020. So that is just one example that really shows how behind we are when it comes to how much, um, Japanese public schools are competent when it comes to using technology well. But then, at the same time I say this, but I do understand where the teachers and administration is coming from. When it comes to a public school education, they have to make sure that they provide equal access to it. So then there are obviously some households that don't have internet at home. So it would then make it unfair if classroom materials are only distributed digitally, because then it creates a gap between those who have computers and internet access at home and those who don't. So I think that's one of the reasons why they had to resort to paper. But again, that's extremely inefficient, unproductive. And also for the teachers, their jobs are difficult enough. Imagine having to distribute materials on top of what they have to do. It's just crazy challenging.
And I mean, it takes so much effort as well to print everything and then to distribute it via bicycle. Just to insert it there, don't feel too discouraged. I saw an ad recently, which is a real thing of 2021, where there was an event, a virtual event, where they basically said, if you want to register, just click on this link. And it was in a magazine, a print magazine, and you would see the Teams link really like written out on paper. So they expected them
Wow,
basically to type it in, which tend to be quite long links, actually.
I see.
It happens in many countries, I think, and there's so many gaps still when it comes to actually making things digitally
Yep,
accessible.
yep.
It steers into the discussion really of, making internet a human right almost, because as electricity, as water, it has become such a necessity that without
Definitely.
it, as you said, it creates gaps between people, and particularly when it comes to most vulnerable people of our societies, which are elderly and children. It just would make sense to introduce a law or a kind of a regulation that would make internet as accessible as those two things: electricity, water systems, etc.
Definitely, definitely. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, then it's really gonna create unequal access to knowledge, and it's only gonna further the wealth gap that we are starting to see in many countries, not just in Japan, but in many countries.
Did I understand it correctly that at Youth Who Code, literally everyone can sign up and register?
Yes. Right now, we provide all of our services for free. And we just hosted a hackathon just last month in the middle of March, where we gathered some of the largest international schools here in Tokyo, and we hosted an inter-school hackathon where our instructors taught the basics of Python programming. And then we had each of the students form groups, form teams, and they would then try to sort of tackle or resolve a problem that has arisen due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, and yeah, there were some interesting projects that came out of it. So I was really proud of my students.
I can imagine it must be quite fascinating to see what students can actually do in a short period of time after
Mm,
they've just learned it.
mm.
Would you say that you mentioned earlier the age, that there is a tendency that children are actually much better educated when it comes to technologies, but also using a computer, software, etc., compared to actually the teachers at school who are supposed to teach them? Isn't there a gap as well, which makes it very difficult to actually say, well, we need to make this mandatory, but we don't have the personnel to actually teach the children?
That's right. That's definitely right. Well, first of all, there's a problem with resources. So I believe that right now the government is still working towards their plan of making sure that there is one laptop or one computer per student in a classroom, which is the ideal sort of environment. But because of the pandemic and because of all the issues that has arisen, I think so far students are still having to share resources amongst themselves, which makes it quite challenging for them to become proficient in learning how to program a computer.
Hmm.
Mm.
And also, one more thing, yeah, with the teachers as well. Um, this is also something that a current teacher had shared with me, but um, because there's a general lack of people who are proficient in programming here in Japan, um, sometimes schools have had to retrain their math teacher or their science teacher so that they can also become the programming teacher at school. So for this adds additional burdens to the teachers themselves because now they have to learn a new academic field on top of what they're already teaching. And I'm sure that it's quite challenging for them too. And they're not competent, but they still have to deliver because it is now mandatory and it's part of
Hmm.
the national curriculum.
Yeah.
So
So
has it been accessible for them? Like, do you feel like the teachers actually want to do that, or do they feel kind of it's imposed on them and they face challenge? I mean, I know that teachers are busy anyways, and particularly in
oh
Japanese schools, right? They're
oh for
terribly busy.
sure.
Like
Oh
you can
for
see it
sure.
even in these old dramas like Great Teacher Onizuka, right? It's kind of like a great example that where the other teachers are kind of very, very busy, and he's the
Yes.
one kind of leaving on time and just doing whatever he wants.
Yes, yes. No, exactly. I mean, here in Japan, a lot of the teachers are required to also support with extracurricular activities for the children. So not only are there teachers, sometimes they're sports instructors, or yeah, or calligraphy instructors, or what have you. So they are already extremely busy. So I think obviously publicly they wouldn't outright complain. But then privately, I'm sure they're having huge challenges right now.
Yeah, and we've heard the same many times beyond programming as a subject with teachers during this pandemic, where teachers are just around the world struggling to make
Right,
that transition online and struggling to teach things using the tools at their disposal because they haven't really had the time to actually familiarize themselves with those tools in the first place. So it's a
exactly,
massive learning curve for a lot of these teachers. So I
exactly.
can only imagine for a maths teacher who's done things for the past 25 years
Mm,
on a blackboard to switch to a completely migrated online working environment, it must be
right,
a very big challenge. um,
definitely.
but what is Youth Who Code doing, in terms of these limitations in mind? How are you guys approaching, teaching these students under such conditions? And how do
Mm,
you like, I've always, wondered how, well, like, what's the best way to engage a younger audience in something that can be very technical, like programming? What is the best way to
mm,
teach those
mm.
students? especially under these
And
circumstances.
And maybe to add to that, why don't you also this is just an open question. I think it's very important to educate the youth, but wouldn't it be also beneficial to offer something like that to teachers?
for sure, for sure. I think we should probably start a new organization together called Teachers Who Code and
Yes.
provide the same services to teachers.
Copyright right there, right? Yeah,
Copyright.
okay.
Um, yeah, well, so going back to your question, I think, the way in which we have to make sure we reach the youth is really through understanding their interests. Um, and so I think, obviously, like you don't want to just jump into text-based programming right away. I think, for a lot of kids, it might be a little bit tedious or it might be quite challenging just to type because you got to remember this new generation of children, their first device is a smartphone. Their first
Mm.
device is a tablet. They don't have experience doing this.
Mm.
They don't have experience typing. So sometimes us instructors, we have to, start from there. We have to teach them how to type first before we even get into text-based programming. But anyways, what I was trying to get at is that I think it's really important for us to do it through gamification and also allow kids to sort of be in charge of their own learning journeys. So we use a fantastic sort of, or at least in some of my previous roles as an educator, running a coding school, we would use freely available child-centric programming languages like Scratch, which I'm sure the two of you have heard of.
Yeah.
And
No.
that's a great way for kids to be able to create their own games and to also create animations that are, yeah, animations that allow them to sort of articulate the world that they are seeing in their minds. Um, and it's sometimes crazy, but it makes like if a child gets hooked, it becomes quite challenging for us to get them off the computers because they're just so into it. And it's everything is so customizable. They can create their own characters just like Yoshi. So they want to keep going further and further and further. So yeah, once you get the kids hooked, they're really, really hooked. But I think, yeah, like I said, gamification and also making sure that the curriculum is very child-centric, it's really important.
And gamification is such an important thing to incorporate into something like this. I completely agree. And I was,
Mm,
working in education myself. I've also seen a couple of programs that have even kind of included versions of popular video games that a lot of kids love
mm,
in a way
mm,
that's tailored around education. So, for instance, I've heard a lot
mm.
of things about the video game Minecraft used in
Yes.
classrooms to teach not just subjects like coding, but even chemistry, mathematics, physics.
Mm, mm,
You know, to
mm.
think that such a thing would be possible, if I was a kid and I knew that would be possible, I would definitely be hooked on the idea. It's like, wow, how does that work? I'd love to try that. Have you familiarized yourself with that? Something like using a video game like Minecraft to
Yeah,
teach kids?
yeah, for sure. For Youth Who Code and for the elementary school students, we ran a Minecraft tournament. And that was also very, very popular amongst the kids. So yeah, we have definitely sort of incorporated Minecraft in our teachings as well.
Hmm. And would you say it was an effective way to teach those kids? Like, were they engaged and was it a useful tool?
Yes, I would say yes. It was definitely a useful tool to sort of get kids hooked and interested in
Hmm.
in in like the fundamentals of programming. But at the same time, I would say that Minecraft is very popular. It's a very popular game amongst young boys. but it's not as popular amongst young girls. There are obviously a couple of female participants that I saw, but I think I would have to say that the majority were younger boys. And so as a organization that values accessibility to all kids, regardless of one's gender, we also have to make a very conscious effort to really figure out how to reach out to the young female audience as well. Trying to get young female girls interested in coding as well. And I think that is definitely, it is a challenge right now. It'll definitely continue to be a challenge for us. But yeah.
Youth who code is relatively new. So how do you, I'm sure you're still in the learning phase, but how do you want to approach particularly female students?
Right. So I think that, for one thing, it's really important for us to have female mentors in the classroom or as instructors. When a young child sees somebody who is, sort of familiar or looks somewhat like them, then it's a little bit more relatable. So instead of like a bearded Japanese man like me, if we have a young, like a female instructor in front of the classroom, then maybe some of the younger Japanese girls will be like, oh, wow, she kind of looks like me. She also has long hair, maybe I can become someone like her in the future. And she serves as a great role model. So we also have to make sure that we have diversity in our teachers as well. So that for our students, they have different role models that they can look up to.
That makes sense. During this conversation about youth who code, I was the whole time thinking, why actually coding? That is also just a question for you, because we haven't really introduced all the lifetime steps you had, but your background is quite diverse as well. You've done lots of different things. So I was wondering why you decided now to go and start an NPO that teaches children how to code, how to program.
Right. So would you like me to jump into my career, or would you like me to sort of answer that question first, and then maybe we can go back and talk about my career?
How you like, however you
However I like,
prefer in this case.
however I
Yeah.
like. Okay, sure. So I guess a really big sort of turning point for me came when I was working as a development worker in Honduras. So this was after I had left finance, and I was in Honduras for a total of 2 years, selling green coffee. And one day I sort of met this young man. I think he was in his early 20s, and he was a Coca-Cola vendor. So he would go from shop to shop and sell Coca-Cola bottles. And he saw me, this strange looking foreign guy sitting alone in the restaurant. And he came up to me and he was like, where are you from? Like, what are you doing here? And casually, he struck up a conversation and I got to know him fairly well. And his English was broken, but it was still good enough for us to have a fairly basic conversation. And so I said, wow, like, how did you learn English? No one else here speaks English. They only speak Spanish. And then he took out his phone and he showed this application called Duolingo. And it's a free app, widely available, that runs on, simple, basic smartphones. And you can use it to learn grammar, and develop your English abilities. And he said he used that as his primary resource in learning how to speak, learning how to speak English. And I was very impressed by that. And I thought, wow, even a 20-something-year-old boy from Honduras, as long as he has a smartphone and internet connection, and the willpower to learn a new academic, subject, he's able to do so. And that really left a long-lasting impression on me, and thought that EdTech was definitely going to be a field that was going to really revolutionize and change the world and democratize education. So that's what sort of got me interested in EdTech and coding, to be specific.
Wow. And I've always seen, I mean, we're all familiar with Duolingo here. We've all used it at some point in our lives. I've,
Yeah.
Sure.
I've always felt it's more of a supplementary application in my case. It's like it could never be the main thing. But, I've never thought about, to those who might not have the opportunities that I have or the privilege that I have. Something as
Mm,
simple as
mm.
Duolingo could give them a world of opportunity, So
Right,
that,
right.
yeah.
Because when it comes to like, listening, yeah, when it comes to learning how to, um, I mean, there's YouTube, right? There's pirated movies that he watched, so he could really understand what like pronunciation and all of that he could pick up through these mediums. But when it came to like grammar, there was no native English speaker in the town where he was from to teach him that. And of course, he couldn't afford to have like a English teacher to teach him online or in person. So the only resource that he could rely on was Duolingo, and also randomly catching random foreigners like me and being like, "Hey, guy, like, where are you from? Can I practice my English with you?" So,
Incredible.
yeah.
So that was the turning point for you. But you studied, you mentioned to us, you actually studied IR, similar as us, international relations and economics, and then you went into
Hmm,
finance.
hmm.
Did you ever actually pursue programming yourself? Is that something you pursued at some point, and when?
No, so yes, like you said, I studied international relations and minored in economics for my bachelor's, and for grad school, I got my master's in education technology. And so all of the programming knowledge that I have, which is fairly limited, to be honest with you, is all self-taught. It's all self-taught through courses like, Code Academy. It's all self-taught through what I was learning through my job actually when I had to teach kids. And so everything that I picked up to this point was never really through formal education, except for maybe like one or two classes that I took in grad school. But besides from that, yeah, it was all just kind of picking different MOOCs, massively open online courses, and yeah, kind of trial and error.
Wow. Now, well, I think Bastion seemed to have dropped out for a moment, but I think he's back on his phone. Did you have a power
Great.
outage or something, Bastion?
I had a blue screen actually, which I never had during the
Oh,
live
wow.
show.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so my device will take some time. I'm sorry, Buzz, if you could set me up, but people can hear me still, and
They
I've
can hear
Great.
you.
now,
They can hear you.
yeah, I now lost unfortunately the what you said, Yoshi. But I was wondering kind of what your thoughts are on how the Japanese education system could be improved in that regard, like from your own experiences or from your own wishes.
Mm. Um, so okay, so as a disclaimer, this is my personal opinion as an outsider to the Japanese education system. So I never attended a Japanese school growing up, right? So this is my perspective as like an outsider. But I do personally believe that there's definitely much room for improvement, and the whole system just needs to be completely overhauled. Um, and there are several reasons. The first one is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the biggest enemy to progress in education today. And um, the Ministry of Education is the one that's deciding on educational content here in Japan. So, in other words, you need approval from the ministry in order for a school to use curriculum and for the teachers to teach it to the students. So, it's a very highly centralized system. And of course, those who work currently in the ministry are oftentimes those who did well in the system, in the current system, and got the high entrance level exams that they needed to get into the right universities that got them the positions in the education ministry. So they don't really see a need to change the system because they themselves are the products of its success.
Mm.
number two is that very much so still in Japan, even in 2021, there's this one test that determines one's fate in life, and it's the college entrance examinations. Um, but then, those tests are only geared towards certain types of learners. So those who are blessed with, I guess, auditory or oral learning abilities, um, those will obviously do well when it comes to test taking, because they can digest information, remember it, and be able to just kind of spit it out, regurgitate it when a test is given to them. But how about those kinesthetic learners? What about the social learner? What about the visual learner? Right? All these different types of learners are currently falling between the cracks, I would say. So currently we have a broken system. And the definition of education in countries like the US is a little bit more wider, because the federal government doesn't really decide the content of education. And I was very fortunate that, went through the whole international education system. And when I applied to college, yes, I did have one like college entrance exam like test, which is called the SATs, the Scholastic Assessment Test. But that's just one component of your overall assessment, right? You still had to write an essay. You still had to partake in extracurricular activities, which were evaluated by the college admissions people. Your personal character was also vouched for by your counselor and also one of your teachers. So it's a very holistic view on an individual, whereas in Japan, it's just one test, right? And if you have a bad day and if you fail that test, then you're pretty much screwed. So these are really, really big issues that I really think that not just Japan, but also other Confucian-based countries need to really fix, because it's inappropriate for the 21st century.
I think those are all fantastic points, and actually that's also what feds me up in my own country, or what I've heard actually about Japan. Oh, I can see that you can still not see me in the screen, so
I can see you
Trying to
actually.
set you up.
Okay, all good, all good. I'll try my best to be back. What I wanted to say was, from what I see here in Germany, for example, that sometimes this digital education lies in the wrong ministries. So, for example, we have people who are in charge of digitalizing education or digitalizing administration, for example, so that there's less bureaucracy or to make it more accessible for people. But in the end, these people are actually not in charge of education, or so there's a clear differentiation between the person who is in charge of just bringing the country forward when it comes to digitization, and the people actually where it matters. So, for example, culturally, education, those are all separate two things, two entities.
Right.
And the ones who are in charge of education, they don't think about the digital implications they could use in order to improve the system, for example.
Right.
Now, as you said, they might not be interested because they are the product of, or the product of the system, and they are the ones who benefited the most from it. That's definitely true. But I find that is a very essential point, so that it becomes kind of a topic in each ministry, but also for each person who is in charge to actually, for example, reinvent the education in Japan.
Right. No, those are all really important points there. And if I may add one more thing, I think that we should never forget about pedagogy. So not just the what, but the how in which you teach to kids. Because as both of you may have experienced during your time here in Japan, but the majority of the population here are very they have what is called eigo allergy, or like they have this allergic reaction when it comes to English, in that sometimes they even know how to speak it, but they're so afraid to use it, right? And I think that we really have to be careful about this, because my biggest sort of concern is that we're going to make the same mistake that we made with English when it comes to coding education here in Japan. So making students remember functions like mindlessly, right? Just like how in English lessons, Japanese students were forced to remember meaningless phrases like "this is a pen," like "this is a pen," and also like overburdening them with like complex grammatical rules that you never really need to know, right? Like I think it's really important for us to remember that English, just like how English is a language, program is also a language. And a language can only be learned through practice and use and by trialing and failing and learning. So I really hope that we don't make the same mistake when it comes to coding education here in Japan, just like what we did with English.
Yeah. No, I could not agree more with you there, Yoshi, really. And
mm.
going back to the point you made about different types of learners, how can we account for those? What kind of learner would you consider yourself to be?
So me personally, I've always been a very kinesthetic learner. So for me, I always have to be very hands-on with everything that I do. So I loved project-based learning because it allowed me to be quite physical with the things that I was learning about, be able to create tangible materialistic objects, and then sort of be able to see it, touch it, feel it, and then be like, oh, okay, so this is what this is about. And I think that, PBL or project-based learning is becoming more and more widespread amongst public schools and also private schools, but it's still very much a minority. It's still very much a small part of the curriculum, because first of all, it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of planning for teachers to be able to come up with PBL lessons, and not to mention the resources that are needed. So I think that, the project-based learning is definitely the methodology that will allow more students to sort of fulfill their own or reach their own potential, or at least learners like myself will be able to do so. But like I said, I think that different learning methods need to match different learning abilities. And right now, we still have this huge disparity that we still need to fix and fill up.
Yeah, no, I don't know if Bastion's gone again, but no, I would say I'm quite similar in that regard. I do like to see the results of what I'm working on, and I need to have some sort of feedback instant. Oh, Bastion is back. Sorry, I
I
just
think
couldn't
it's
hear
back.
you.
Yeah, I think it's back.
No, no,
Okay,
I'm
Yeah.
yeah.
here. I'm here. Sorry, I'm interrupting with these things, but that's sometimes how it is with doing things digitally.
Yes.
We are living in this interesting. We talk about these topics, but in the end, like the internet connection or anywhere in the world, technology doesn't work as flawlessly as we would like it to be or how we
As
imagine
you
it
can
to
see.
be.
Exactly.
Exactly. Like for with the internet connection, for example, that we still have like buffer or that we still have delay or all these
Mm,
things.
mm,
It's quite fascinating that we still
mm.
haven't been to that point where we can actually do something without any kind of delay. But I think 5G will allow us to do so in some degrees or some parts.
True.
Some
But
point, yeah. No, which is why I think
anyways,
it's very important to have also, troubleshooting and critical thinking skills in combination
Mm.
to whatever you learn in tech, because, as soon as something goes wrong, it's really important to kind of learn how to fix that, because a lot of people still struggle
That's
with
right.
that, I think, based on what I've been seeing. So more than anything, and I think that applies to
That's right.
programming in general, because you'd always see that there's something wrong, and in order to fix that issue, you would need to have critical thinking skills, because you'd have to think, okay, where is the problem coming from? Why
Exactly.
is this happening, right?
so that was Buzz basically telling me, please don't have a blue screen again. um, we've been roughly live an hour.
Yeah.
So maybe Buzz, if you have a final question, I might have actually one, since
Go
I have
for
to
it. Go for
apologize.
it,
Like,
Bastian.
the last few minutes were a bit difficult for me to follow at the whole time, but what would you wish for when it comes to the Japanese education system, when it comes to particularly for coding, programming in the near future? How would you like actually Japan to implement these kind of subjects into the curriculum to make it more accessible?
Mm, mm. So, first of all, I really hope that the government will follow through with its promises of making sure that the infrastructure, especially for public schools, that is set right so that students have an access to a workable computer with a stable internet connection. I think those are really the basics, the fundamentals that needs to be provided. So the infrastructure definitely needs to be there. And also, like I said, with regards to the pedagogy, we really have to stay away from instruction-based learning methods. So um, if students have to sort of copy code by code, line by line, that is a red flag. That is definitely not the way in which programming should be taught. Because I've just heard so many stories of even students at the university level where they just have to memorize lines of code, be able to regurgitate that on a test, and then they pass. So for example, if there is a slight sort of difference in what that code needs to do, the students aren't able to figure it out because they don't have those critical thinking muscles developed in their brains. They've only been trained to remember and regurgitate, so they can't solve these problems that aren't on the manual, so to say. So there's that as well. But finally, I think this is the most important point. Um, and this is also another reason why we started Youth Who Code. You know, coding or tech in general is a very powerful tool. And I think, with great power, right, great comes great responsibility. And so it shouldn't be taught just because it will future-proof your one's career, or it shouldn't be taught just because everybody else is learning it. It should really it should be seen as a powerful tool that can impact the world in a positive way. And that's why our slogan at Youth Who Code is Code for Impact, you know. Um, and we really want to make sure that, um, yeah, that students are able to see problems in their own communities or in their own lives or in their own countries and use code or use the power of technology as a tool that can help them tackle or solve these problems. Um, and that's really the sort of the main mission that I really hope that we can serve through my nonprofit organization, through this social enterprise, because that's a really critical piece of the puzzle that's currently missing.
Well,
I love it.
yeah, I loved it too. That was beautifully said, Yoshi, really. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation today. You're a fantastic storyteller, I must say. And I really enjoyed. I could go for another 2 hours if if I had the time, and if I would respect your time. But no, is there anything
Thank you.
you'd like to leave our audience with? I know Youth Who Code, you guys are looking for volunteers to help with this initiative. Is there anything you'd like to, mention before we close off?
Yeah, of course. So, if you are let's say if you're a parent that wants your child to learn about coding through events and activities, please visit our website, youthucode.org. If you currently work as a programmer yourself, a software developer in the tech field, and want to share your skills and your knowledge with our students, then also please kindly sign up as a volunteer at youthucode.org. And yeah, we always welcome any sort of help, whether it be sponsorships or partnerships. So looking forward to collaborating with some of you listeners.
And of course, Youth of Who Code, the link is in the doobly-doo in the description. So find it there. It should be very easy to find. Yoshi, thanks so much for being with us. For all the viewers and listeners, thanks for tuning in. Of course, if you have any questions, comments afterwards, feel free to shoot them to us, either in the comments or as a PM. We will be happy to forward them to Yoshi and see if he can answer them, I'm pretty sure. So thanks so much for tuning in. Definitely check out Youth Who Code and definitely follow Yoshi for further information on everything.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity, Bastian and Bastian.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. And this is Bento Bureau signing off. Have a lovely day, everyone.